environmental, economic, and recreational interests from the threat of invasive species. So NBISC is a regional chapter of the larger Canada Invasive, which is our national organization. So we are affiliated with the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council, NPEI, and NBC, all over the place. And what we do is education and awareness, so coming and talking to people about invasive species like this, facilitating collaboration to improve management, so working with government agencies, regional service commissions, municipalities, different stakeholders kind of work together to create coordinated response to invasive species, and providing knowledge and expertise. So we really try to be a knowledge hub around invasive species, and if we don't know it, we have a lot of really good allies who can help us find any information around invasive species. So what is an invasive species? I've got a bunch of pictures here, ones you're probably familiar with. So giant hogweed, these are Asian carp, which is 3 different kinds of invasive carp, sea lampreys, lionfish, zebra mussels, pythons, emerald ash borer, European starlings, and hemlock woolly adelgid. All of these are invasive somewhere, not all of them here, but most. So what does it mean to be an invasive species? So basically they need 3 elements. So it needs to be non-native, so it comes from somewhere else, usually like another continent, Europe or Asia, but sometimes it's places other places in North America, just not New Brunswick. That it needs to spread rapidly. So if you think of something like your garden plants, they're probably non-native, but they stay in your garden and die, so that's not invasive. Something needs to be able to like escape your garden and out into the wilderness to be considered invasive. So it spreads rapidly and then harmful. If it has those first two factors but doesn't cause any harm, it wouldn't be considered invasive. And harmful is a pretty large umbrella. It goes to things that affect the environment negatively, but also society and the economy. And then, so there's kind of like a spectrum of invasiveness. So that we have our native species, which at the bottom you have like species at risk and endangered, which aren't spreading anywhere as much as we wish they would. Then there's native, so ones that are fine, and then nuisance. So a nuisance species would be something like Virginia creeper, where it's native, but it spreads rapidly and causes problems. But because it's native, we wouldn't consider it an invasive. And then we hop up to well-behaved exotic. So that is something like your garden annuals. They are non-native here, but they die every winter. You have to replace them, so there's no worry about them causing any damage. So well-behaved exotic. And you'll notice there's a little asterisk there that says for now. So a lot of those things, like your annuals, they're kept in control by environmental factors like the cold. So as the climate warms and as other global factors change, that could change. Things could become invasive that are not considered invasive right now. Next would be naturalized. Naturalized has a bit of a complex definition, and people use kind of different definitions, but at the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council, we would consider a species that has been here a really long time, but would have been invasive when it arrived. So take, for example, like the European starling. When that got here, it would have caused a lot of environmental damage and knock-on effects on other birds and ecosystems and stuff. And it obviously spread rapidly. They went from being 100 birds in New York to 100 million birds all over North America. But that happened so long ago that the environment has reached a new steady state. They're not spreading anymore. They're not causing new damage. And if you were to try and remove them, that would cause its own damages because the environment has adjusted to having them here. And then there is invasive. So that's typically stuff that is newer, or if it's not newer, it's still spreading, still causing new damage. So that's kind of the spectrum. And all of those things can kind of shift depending on different factors and different definitions. Other people would say naturalized means something else, but it's a bit complex. So we're going to do a little game to see if we're all on the same page about what's invasive and what's not invasive. So does everyone know what this is? Poison ivy? All right. Can I get a show of hands? Invasive? Non-invasive?
Which of which?
Invasive?
Right hand?
Yeah. Well, no, just raise your hand.
Oh,
Invasive.
okay.
No? Non-invasive? Yeah, exactly. You guys are way better than the 7th graders I gave this. So yeah, so it can be harmful, it can spread rapidly, but it's native, so non-invasive. Next we have tomatoes. Invasive? Non-invasive? Yeah, exactly. So they're exotic, but they're not spreading anywhere and they're not causing any harm. Oh, went wrong way. Turkeys. Wild turkeys. Invasive? Non-invasive? So this is a bit of a trick question because it's still a question to us in the invasive species space. So as you might know, wild turkeys are native to southern Maine, but they have been having a range expansion up into New Brunswick. And that has to do a lot with human factors. People help them along. They do really well in human settlements, but also people are interested in a regulated hunt, so they pick them up and take them all over the province. So a natural range expansion, you wouldn't typically consider that to be an invasive species because it's a species that's moving naturally. But with the factors that it's like humans are helping move it, and then also we don't have a good idea of how this will impact the environment. New Brunswick doesn't have a large ground foraging bird like this, so we don't really know how it'll affect other species yet. So as this develops, we'll probably have a better answer about whether it's invasive or not, but this is an open question. Zebra mussels, invasive? Non-invasive? Okay, good. Everyone's on the same page. So you will have heard about these probably a lot in the last year or so. So these are zebra mussels. They're incredibly invasive. They originate in Europe. They expand incredibly rapidly into new systems, and they are extremely harmful both to the environment and to the economy. So easy one, that one. This one, blue-green algae, cyanobacteria. Invasive, non-invasive, exactly. So again, harmful and expanding rapidly due to climate change and other environmental factors, as well as it seems like it's a lot more common because people are more aware of it, people are talking about it more. But it is native, it's been here the whole time, so non-invasive. Next, so what are the invasive species impacts? Why should people care about them? So a major one is increased predation of native species, obviously coming over here and eating the adults or the eggs or whatever, and alteration of predator-prey dynamics. So up there we have a photo of sharks and a lionfish. In their natural environment, these sharks would be the apex predator, but these lionfish come in and they are poisonous. So if the sharks try to eat them, they will die. And obviously a large dieback of the apex predator in a system will have severe knock-on effects on the whole food chain. Then they outcompete native species for food and space. In this photo, you see an entire understory that's been overtaken by garlic mustard. So that's displacing our native ephemeral species, taking up the light, the nutrients, and the space that they need to survive. And then bring new diseases. So a species can either transport a new disease, so European domestic rabbits can spread a lot of diseases to our native rabbits, or the invasive species can be the disease itself. So an example is the white nose fungus. Obviously that existed in on another continent where the bats there were acclimatized to it. They could handle low levels of infection, and then they brought it, some hikers brought it here from not cleaning their boots, and it spread and decimated our bat populations, as I'm sure everyone knows. So that's just a couple, and then there are societal impacts. There's decreased ecosystem services. So for this example, we have flood prevention. Our native wetland species are really good at buffering floods. They have deep root systems that help put that water into the ground. And other species, for example, Phragmites, which you will have seen around this region, that has a much shallower root system and is much less able to buffer flood waters and other kind of stuff. Then there's impacts to infrastructure. In this photograph, we have a boat propeller that's covered in zebra mussels. So obviously that impacts the functioning of that propeller, but anywhere that water is being taken in will be infested with this. So the zebra mussels are all inside the compartments of the motor, and that also happens for industrial uses. So a lot of energy plants or industrial factories and stuff have water intake directly from the rivers, and when they intake that, it takes all that and it causes all their pipes to be blocked and other damages, which is obviously very expensive to treat and prevent. Okay. And then impacts to human health. So giant hogweed, I'm sure many of you know, has phototoxic sap. So if you were to get it on your skin in the sunshine, it'll cause those 3rd-degree burns. And then zebra mussels are extremely sharp. So that's a huge issue that they have in Ontario, where they're pretty ubiquitous. You can't walk on the beaches barefoot anywhere because they'll cut you all apart. And impacts to recreation. So as you can see, this plant species in the water here, I think, is hydrilla, but we don't have that here in New Brunswick. We have a very similar species, though, Eurasian water milfoil, which will do the same thing where it clogs up the waterways. So obviously that makes it hard for a boat to pass through. You can't fish in it. I don't know about you, but I don't want to swim in that.
Yeah.
So obviously there's some impacts to recreation there.
Can I just ask about hydrilla?
Yeah.
I was seeing something about that wherever in Ontario or whatever. So is that something that could end up here?
Yes, it could.
Okay.
It just arrived in Ontario within the last, I think, few months.
Okay.
It was found there for the first time, but it's pretty widespread in the United States and coming this way. And then,
I mean, it looks like a Lodia or something, doesn't it?
pretty similar,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. A lot of the pond ones kind of have the same look. You have to be really good at plant identification to tell. And then here's a literal impact of invasive.
Whoa!
So those are those Asian carp I was telling you about at the very beginning. There are 3 species that have been introduced into the Mississippi Delta and have spread pretty far throughout the southern United States and have worked their way all the way up to the Canadian border. Both the American government and the Canadian government have invested heavily to not have this happen to the Great Lakes. There's an electrified gate between the Mississippi Delta and the Great Lakes to prevent these guys. And then they have a lot of negative environmental effects, but they also do this, where if you pass your boat through them, it agitates them, they jump out of the water. So you might have seen like hillbilly fishing where they go through and try and catch as many as they can from getting them to jump in the boat, or I've seen people on like their little water skis in a football helmet trying to like hit the fish. It's crazy. But obviously that impacts the recreational value of the river. Not a lot of people want to go get hit in the face with a fish when they go out on their boat.
What are the species?
I think it's, so the umbrella term is Asian carp, but the individual species are big head carp, silver carp, and grass carp, I think.
So 3 kinds of carp, yeah.
Yes, yeah. But in areas where they typically co-occur. So there's usually, if you have one, you have them all.
Oh.
Are they edible?
They are.
Because you could fish them like crazy.
Yes,
Feed
people
them.
do fish them. They're just extremely widespread, and they were very well established by the time people started to care about it. So they're hard to get rid of for sure. They're incredible. They have incredibly high fecundity, so they just keep making more of them. Oh, I'm not playing that again. So what can be done about them? So we have a few eradication and control methods. So herbicide application is a big one. Manual removals. This is python hunters, so it's very common that there will be a bounty program on typically animal species, not so much plants. This is a show in the Florida Everglades where pythons are invasive, and they hunt them. Then there's large machinery removals, and this one's our favorite. So this dog is trained to sniff zebra mussels. So as a boat's coming through a checkpoint, he'll kind of do a little sweep of the car, and if he detects zebra mussels, that boat will be sent to a decontamination station to be decontaminated, and then it won't spread zebra mussels to other water bodies. So they actually have a couple of these employed by the Alberta government. So they're out there all the time sniffing your boat. But there are some problems with that. So first is time. So this photo is of stem injecting herbicide. So if anyone can think of a patch of Japanese knotweed or Phragmites in your mind, imagine having to inject every single stem with herbicide. Obviously extremely time intensive. Then it can be extremely expensive. Here we have a photo of some people hunting these feral pigs from a helicopter. Helicopter's expensive, drones expensive, herbicides expensive, man hours are expensive. So that's the real holdback to a lot of control and eradication efforts is the money. And then finally, they can sometimes be minimally effective. So this is a lionfish cookbook. You might have heard of like eat invasives and stuff. Great idea, but in order to make an impact on the invasive species population, you would have to eat so much of it. And people they're not into it. I've tried to talk people into eating Japanese knotweed, and they won't do it. And I've heard people who try, they're like, it's a lie, it's not good. So, minimally effective. So why not just get rid of them? Labor intensive, time consuming, extremely costly, minimally effective. So therefore us as an invasive species council and kind of anyone working in the invasive species space is more focused on preventing new introduction and preventing spread rather than control and eradication. Another way to visualize that, this is the invasion curve. So it shows time since introduction versus area infested and control costs. So if we were to catch it way at the beginning, it would be extremely simple to get rid of it. You know, just pull one plant, get one fish, whatever. But as you go up in time, it's been here longer, they spread to more areas, and it gets way harder to remove them. So typically we have detection here where prevention is still possible and simple, but typically we don't get anything done up there until we're up there where public awareness is. And as you can see, that's when eradication, we've kind of already lost at that point. So we really want to focus on early detection and rapid response to really handle invasive species. And how do invasive species spread? There's a couple different pathways of invasion. So there's natural spread, which is floating downstream, animal dispersal, so it gets carried by a bird from one forest to another, parasitic relationship, so it's moving within a different animal, and natural movement, so like the turkeys, it's walking itself wherever it's going. And then there's human activity, so things like international shipping, pets and farm animals, horticultural trade, hitchhikers, so if you've got seeds or bugs on you or whatever, you're picking them up and carrying them. We'll get a little more into that later in the presentation, but those are kind of the main factors. But there are many different ways that invasive species are introduced. Does anyone have any questions before I jump into the invasive species profiles?
Is there lionfish in Canada?
There's not. They are mostly invasive in like around the Florida area. All right, we'll jump right in. So zebra and quagga mussels. We only have zebra mussels here in New Brunswick, but typically where they exist, zebra mussels and quagga mussels co-occur. That's not the case in New Brunswick yet. Hopefully it will stay that way. So these are small freshwater mussels. They're filter feeders. They were first identified in the Great Lakes area in 1986, and by 1990 they were in every Great Lake. That's partially because it took a long time for people to notice, but also because they spread extremely rapidly. They were first found in New Brunswick in 2023, and we are working with a lot of different partners to understand how quickly they're spreading and to where. These guys got to New Brunswick because they were spread to a lake on the other side of the Quebec border that flows into the Willistic St. John. So these have been carried by natural flows kind of down the entire Willistic tributary, and it's downstream tributaries.
Where are they in the St. John?
Yeah, in the St. John, between Edmonton and Fredericton right now. But because they're in a system that's going to naturally flow downstream, we're expecting them to go all the way down, almost to St. John, and at that point the salt content is high enough to prevent them from spreading any further. But they will spread basically throughout the St. John tributaries, and there's not much to be done about that. There is a lot to be done to prevent them from going other places, though. So this is a little ID for you. So they're typically 2 to 2.5 centimeters, but up to 4, so very small. They have this triangular shell. You can see the top edge is flat. So if you were to pick one up, you could balance it on that edge, which is the distinguishing feature from quagga mussels. The quagga mussel is more rounded and it would fall over. Life cycle, they produce free-floating veligers or larvae that exist in the water column. They get carried by water flows to wherever they settle out and create an adult mussel. The larvae are invisible to the naked eye and can spread in any tiny amount of water. So that's a really large way that they spread is being carried in different like water, so in boats and whatever. And habitat, freshwater environments, lakes, rivers, man-made ponds, and will colonize any hard surface. So rocks, docks, plants, other animals. These guys are a big risk to our native mussels because they will attach to the outside of the native mussel and suffocate it, like hold it closed. They are quite easy to distinguish from our native mussels. They are only in fresh water, so if it's in salt water, you can completely discount it. And then our native freshwater mussels are much bigger. They're about this big, whereas a zebra mussel is going to be about that big. So very easy to tell the size difference there. And then here are some of the negative environmental and social effects. So you can see this pipe is completely blocked up from zebra mussels, which presents a significant cost to any kind of industry that's reliant on water intake. You can see this beach is entirely covered in zebra mussel shells, which, as I mentioned, are extremely sharp, so you can't walk on this beach anymore. And you can see a little zebra mussel is attached to that dragonfly nymph, so it's negatively affecting kind of all of the species in the system. And the main way that they affect the environment and the biosphere is they colonize up to 700,000 per square meter, so incredible density. And they are filter feeders, so at that density, they are sucking everything out of the water, all of the nutrients, which then causes an ecosystem collapse because nothing else in the system can eat. They also have some negative effects on things like fish who don't want to nest and lay their eggs on zebra mussels. And in areas where you have both zebra and quagga mussels, the zebra mussels will colonize every hard surface, and quagga mussels will cover every soft surface, and basically cover everything that there is. So we are very lucky we don't have quagga mussels yet.
What's the picture on the top left?
This,
Yeah.
I think that is a buoy. To be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure what's under there.
The fishing boat went from the St. John River into the Miramichi River. It could easily carry it, couldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to get into that a little bit later, but we have a program called Clean, Drain, Dry, really emphasizing making sure people are cleaning their boats, especially when they're coming off of the St. John right now. Because you'll see in a couple of these profiles, the St. John has a lot more of these invasive species that are not existing in other systems in New Brunswick, so we really want to keep them there.
How long can they live out of water?
Up to 30 days in the right conditions. Yeah. So yeah, this one is really kind of one of the worst invasive species, the hardest to tackle for sure. And there are basically no control efforts or options once it's in a system. If it's in a very small pond or something, you could drain down, take down the water and fill it with pesticides, but you have to be willing to kill everything in the water body, and you have to be able to, it has to be a closed water body. So for instance, in the Willistic one, we would be unwilling to do that because we don't want to kill everything in there, but also you couldn't treat that much water. And there's always a new flow of zebra mussels coming in from that lake at the top. So next, Eurasian water milfoil. This is another one that only exists on the Willistic and in its tributaries. So this was discovered in 2015 and it's been spreading pretty rapidly since then. It's this submerged aquatic plant. It creates thick mats on top of the water, so it'll grow up from the bottom and cover the surface, which clogs waterways, altering the river flow, and then it also leaves no light for other plants. So it blocks the light from the top, so anything trying to grow on the bottom can't survive. You can see here it kind of grows in these little segments, and if it were to break off in between those segments, each one of them can create a new plant. So each little piece can root, which then obviously if you drive your boat propeller through it, chop it all up, then you're setting off hundreds and thousands of new plants. So it's extremely easy to spread this one. And it can survive out of water for a good period of time, which means if you pick it up on your boat and you, even if you have your boat out of water for a few weeks, it could still potentially survive when you put it into a new water body. Identification. So it typically has a red to light yellow stem, and the leaves are spaced about a centimeter or more apart. Some long stretches cannot have any leaves at all because they drop them naturally. The leaves are, as you can see here, they're whorled around the stem, and each leaf consists of 12 or more pairs of little leaflets. That's one of the major distinguishing features from our native water milfoil. So we have an extremely similar native plant. Basically, unless you have both sitting there in front of you, it's really extremely difficult to tell the difference. I'm not even that good at it. I've been practicing, but one of the main things is that it will have fewer thread-like leaflets, so less than 12. They flower in late July, so that's these little guys, and it exists in freshwater like lakes, rivers, and ponds. So this is an example, I'm not sure exactly where, but this is along the Willistic St. John. So here's a picture in 2016, and then the same location in 2019. I highly doubt those people would want to swim in this water. So as you can see, it kind of creates these nasty mats on the top, and then that, as they rot away, that takes oxygen from the system as well.
Mm.
There must be lots of, like, it looks like algae all growing through
Yeah,
it too, right?
exactly, yeah. So not great. So again, that's one that's only on the Willistic St. John right now, and we really want to do everything we can to keep it there. Next, Japanese knotweed. I'm sure you have all seen this. This is pretty ubiquitous in New Brunswick and really everywhere. This is known as the world's worst invasive plant. So it grows in these really dense thickets that reduce sun penetration to the ground and degrade wetland habitats. And they can grow through asphalt and concrete. So this one's really bad for infrastructure. It'll pop up through roads. It'll pop up through people's foundations. It's in its native habitat in Japan. It grows on volcano sides. So it is, and like it's built to pop up through pop up through lava flows. So obviously a little concrete's not going to do anything. And for management, common control methods are mechanical treatments, so digging. There's tarp solarizing, so covering a patch in a tarp for a number of years, and stem or foliar herbicide applications. There's also directed heat, but that one's not super effective. Herbicide is really the main control method that everyone uses. Mechanical treatments like digging, you would have to get a massive excavator to bury it at least 5 feet underground for it to be controlled. So really, really hard to get rid of this guy.
What herbicide?
Pardon?
What herbicide do you?
Glyphosate.
Mm.
We have not treated anything with herbicide in New Brunswick. Not me.
Can you burn
You can, you can burn it to the ground, but it'll just pop right back up. Yeah. Typically people will burn, like, they'll cut it all down, burn the scrap, and then tarp over the cut stems. So identification, like I said, I'm sure you've all seen this. It's very common and very distinctive looking. So leaves, oval to triangular with a pointed tip and a flat base. As you can see in a lot of these pictures, it's got it's almost squared off at the bottom, so that's very distinct. And then it also zigzags between the leaves, as you can kind of see in that second photo. The stems are hollow, smooth, and green with purple splotches. They are hollow like bamboo and segmented. So a lot of people, you'll hear, they're like, oh, I have a bamboo infestation. You hear that a lot in New Brunswick. This is what people mean when they say that. And the large clusters of tiny white flowers. So as you can see there on the bottom. And those pop up towards the end of the summer. And that's one of the major reasons people plant this, is for the pretty flowers, and then also as a living fence, because that really dense growth habit obviously makes it pretty good to block out your neighbors.
Can you cut it to the ground, or at least someone said you can burn it to the ground, but can you then plant something that would grow really fast to like provide a cover so it doesn't get sunshine? Has that been tried?
You can, and it has been tried. It reduces growth, but for the most part, it'll still grow up kind of in between. Even here in Sackville, I did a treatment of Japanese knotweed, and it was growing fully into the forest. So you have to do, you'd have to block off a lot of the sun, and it's really not feasible. Even when people tarp it, so you take a black tarp and you cover it for 5+ years, and even then sometimes when people pull it back, it still grows back. So this is kind of the unkillable plant.
I noticed in Fundy National Park, they have a tarp there next to the point
Yes.
of the bridge,
Um,
and they just started planting, it was on top of it, but they've had the tarp there for 6-7
yes,
years.
yeah.
But this year I noticed there was something, they
Yeah,
planted something.
so they're doing interplanting, so pretty much what you said, where they've done, I think 7 years on that patch where they've had it tarped over, and now they've planted through the tarp with wood stakes. So I think it was dogwood, aspen, willows, kind of that stuff that's going to grow really fast and put out a lot of leaves to kind of shade it out. And that is likely going to be effective because they've tarped it for so long before then. But just going straight to interplanting wouldn't work. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out actually. They're doing a lot of work in Fundy to reduce their invasive species. So they're doing a really great job over there and developing a lot of new strategies. So really excited to see if that is successful.
Sorry, does Japanese knotweed often colonize an area that's been recently disturbed?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I know where I've seen it frequently is if there's been a previous structure there
Mhm.
that perhaps has been removed or burned,
Yeah.
you'll often see this take over.
It is very successful in disturbed environments, and a lot of the time, this is like a lot of old properties will have had this planted, and then you move the building, and then it just goes crazy. And also, it's oftentimes associated with kind of disturbed environments because fill is a huge way that this spreads. So it's got underground rhizomes. That's the main way that it spreads. It does produce seed, but there's debate about whether the seed actually is fertile and whether that's how it spreads at all. Typically, it's from broken pieces of the plant being picked up and carried in some way. So like on infill or on the tires of like ATVs or construction equipment, things like that, that's how it typically spreads. And people planting it. I'm still fighting with people on Facebook who do not plant this.
How would people would really plant it?
Oh, absolutely.
Are they just digging it up from somewhere else, or
Yep.
there's no one selling this? It's
No,
not-
there's no regulation in New Brunswick telling people they can't sell it. There's no regulation about invasive species at all in New Brunswick, which is not great. But no, they don't sell this at garden centers, but you can see in like gardening groups or free or for sales, people asking for a cutting to move over, and then they do not like it when you tell them not to do that.
And there's another species that's got bigger leaves that's similar too, I see. And I remember
Yes.
as a kid digging that up and bringing it home, planting it.
Yeah, it's very common. Yeah, there's this one, so there's Japanese knotweed, and then there's what's called Bohemian knotweed, which is basically the exact same but much bigger. And then I've seen patches in New Brunswick where I'm like, that seems like it might be the Bohemian one, but right now we only know that Japanese knotweed is here.
Okay.
But it's
You have
same.
to go to Nova
with that.
Scotia for the big one.
Yeah.
Does it have any commercial use?
There is not here in Canada, but there is overseas. They take this really, really serious in the UK. If you have this on your property in the UK, you can't get a mortgage, and you can be charged for not handling it. So there is some use in like biogas and alternative energy, like burning it or using it for natural gas.
But it is edible too, right?
Yes, it is edible. It has like a sour taste, kind of like rhubarb. So people will often use it in place of rhubarb in like jams or pies or whatever. And then people also say it tastes like asparagus. To me, those are different things. So I don't know how that works. It looks like asparagus, but
Maybe in early spring when it's really small, maybe it's more like asparagus.
yes, I have only tried it when it's bigger and sour, but you're probably right that it's when it's younger. It's not great to eat it though because it does take on a lot of heavy metals. So you have to be very knowledgeable about the soil that you're taking it from before you should eat this. They don't really advertise that on the Japanese knotweed recipes, that you have to be very careful about the soil you're taking it from.
You know if PEI have regulations regarding Japanese knotweed removal and so on?
I don't know what kind of regulations they have there. So yes, Phragmites and / common reed. You will have definitely seen this around this area as well and spreading quickly. So it's a perennial reed grass native to Eurasia, commonly found in wetlands, field edges, and along shorelines. If you think of a thatched roof, this is what the thatch is. So they use it for that over where it's native, but here we don't have thatched roofs, so there's no use for it. There are 2 subspecies in Canada, the native, Phragmites australis americanus, and then the highly invasive Australis australis. Really hard to tell the difference. Most people recommend that you can really only tell using genetic testing. But there are a couple indicating factors that give you a good idea of which one you got. Current hotspot, Riverview and Moncton, but really kind of all of southeastern New Brunswick at this point, and spreading throughout New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. It spreads via seeds, rhizomes, and stolons. This one's also very ubiquitous in southern Ontario and Quebec. If you go anywhere, you'll see this. Yeah.
What's a stolon?
It's like an overground, kind of like a root, kind of like a stem in between, and when those get picked up or broken apart, that can create an entire new plant. So that
strawberries do.
yes, exactly. Yeah, it's like a little runner, and that's one of the major ways it gets spread around New Brunswick. And anywhere that it's infested, it gets picked up by kind of mowing equipment, ATVs, whatever, and gets spread everywhere. If you've been to the riverfront area in Riverview and Moncton, you'll know that this is completely taken over there. And that's where they do mosquito spraying on what's essentially a tank. And you can look at like an overhead view and see the Phragmites falling along the tracks. And they've actually been really great. They've been working with us to reduce that threat, and they're replacing their mosquito sprayers with drone spraying, which will hopefully reduce the spread of Phragmites and anything else they might be kind of spreading around. So the concerns with this one, it establishes rapidly and forms really tall, dense monocultures that outcompete native plants and native plant species. It reduces habitat and food sources for wildlife. It can also trap wildlife. So a patch of Phragmites can grow up to 200 stems per square meter, and that's just live stems. It also stays standing when it's dead, so you've got 200 plus stems per square meter. I, as an adult person, have tried to walk through a patch of Phragmites and can't do it. So you can imagine like a tiny bird or a turtle, they get trapped in there really easily. It also has a very high metabolic rate, so it's converting water and evaporating it very quickly, which lowers the water levels. Typically wetlands have a lot of like little streams and stuff going through them, and that's how ducks and turtles navigate. But this will kind of cause so much evaporation that those tributaries dry up. The dead stalks are a fire hazard. So as I said, they stay standing over winter, but that's just dry grass. So obviously if a single spark hits that, it's gonna light up all over. And it typically grows along roadways, which presents a significant danger because of spark coming off of cars. And then it connects disconnected ecosystems. So if you've got it growing all the way along a road, it'll connect this wetland to that wetland and this forest to that forest, and then light it all on fire. Not great. And it impedes recreational activities, swimming, boating, angling. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a tall grass species that turns up a lot in the sort of sunken area between the east and westbound lanes on Trans-Canada, for example.
Yes.
Is that Phragmites?
If I'm thinking of the right, yeah.
It is.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, it's gonna be this guy.
Because it's well established between here and Nova Scotia.
Yes, very much. Yeah, that highway's got quite a few large patches now. And as you might have noticed, just over the last few years, that's expanded quite significantly.
Yes.
Do you remember if Heinrich warned us about that?
No.
So for management, New Brunswick Invasive Species Council has been working with a lot of different partners to try and track the spread of Phragmites throughout New Brunswick. We've also been doing a couple different control efforts. We've done, mostly so far we've done cutting and manual removal, so digging. What we learned from that is that it's not effective at all. It's incredibly labor intensive, time intensive, and not that effective. There is chemical control, so that's typically what they use out in places where this is really, really ubiquitous, so like Ontario and Quebec, they use glyphosate or Invasive to treat it chemically. We haven't tried that here in New Brunswick, but it's likely that we will in the near future, just because everything else that we have tried has been ineffective. And there exists currently there's no biological controls for use in Canada. So a biological control is when, so most invasive species, one of the reasons they do really, really well when they get here or wherever is that whatever controls them at home, whatever predator or disease or whatever that keeps them in check at home, it's not here. So it's able to run wild. So there are researchers who are focused on identifying those species in the home range and bringing them here. You guys might have heard of cane toads in Australia, so those were brought to Australia to treat cane beetle. It didn't treat the cane beetle at all, but it ate all of the native species and poisoned them all. So not great. So they used to be really willy-nilly about it, but based on those lessons, now they take it very, very serious. So they'll do extensive testing in the native range, and then they'll bring it here and test it typically for over a decade to make sure that it won't have any of those unexpected effects. There's a really, really promising biological control for Phragmites coming out of the University of Toronto. They're looking at a little moth. I'm not really sure how it kills Phragmites, but it does. So In the next 5 to 10 years, there is likely going to be biological control for this, but not yet. And biological controls are typically going to just keep something in check. They're not going to eradicate anything.
We had a patch of Phragmites in our yard, and we had goats during COVID.
Yeah.
And the goats basically eliminated the Phragmites, and we've had goats for 2 years now. Phragmites has not come back in our yard.
That's really interesting. We are actually looking, it's a bit of a fad in the environmental space right now to have goats, or in the invasive species space. You could see like every week there's a little like, oh, this park had goats come eat their invasive species. So we're like, should we have goats? Maybe. We're looking at it. But apparently it is very effective at controlling certain invasive species, including Phragmites, and then also buckthorn, which we're going to get to. Identification. So persist annually. It begins growing in the spring as a kind of like a large grass, and then it'll grow these big fluffy seed heads, very distinctive, and those will persist into the fall. And come winter, they will be dead and remain standing. Two big differences between that and the native species. The native species will die much sooner. So a thing you'll notice kind of about a lot of invasive species is they persist a lot longer into the fall than our native species, and they'll also typically start growing earlier in the spring. So when everything else is dead, this guy is still green. And the same with buckthorn, which we'll, like I said, we'll get to. Leaves, long lance-shaped blue-green leaves with smooth, sharp edges. They tightly adhere to the stem, kind of like a sheath. The native species has yellow-green leaves, which again is one of those things that unless you have both of them there in front of you, not super helpful. But the tightly adheres to the sheath. That one is pretty distinctive. So if you were to go to pull on a leaf with Phragmites, be careful, it's very sharp. You can cut your fingers. But if you were to pull, it wouldn't come away from the stem at all. Whereas a native species, if you were to pull it away, it would come away from the stem. Flowers, large, fan-like with many branches. It initially comes out as the big purple flower head, which then transitions to this kind of buff, tan, fluffy seed head. That's pretty similar to the native species. The native species, typically it's sparser and smaller, but again, that's kind of a comparison judgment. Newer patches of Phragmites, like the invasive Phragmites, will also typically have smaller and less dense seed heads, so that one's a little tricky to use as an identification feature. For the stem, it's solid green in color all the way over. It's hollow and very sturdy. The native species will be red at the base, typically, but not always. So again, like all of the identification features for Phragmites is like usually, probably, kind of, sometimes. And then it's a very, very tall grass, so it will be taller than the native species, but again, new patches do not grow to the typical height of 3 to 5 meters, but in New Brunswick, it's typically between 2 and 4. Our thoughts is that is because we don't have ideal climatic conditions here. It might be just a little bit too cold for it to reach its full potential, but it's doing well enough. And then habitat, common roadside ditches, wetlands, and other wet environments. Anywhere that's mostly wet, most of the time, will get Phragmites. Then we have glossy buckthorn, another one that's very, very common in New Brunswick. So widespread in all of the maritime provinces. It's a small deciduous shrub or tree that's incredibly invasive along forest edges. It blocks native species from growing, negatively impacting native plant and insect diversity. So this one you'll see a lot in the Fredericton area and also the Moncton area. And it's pretty distinctive because if you walk down like a trail, all along the side is glossy buckthorn, but if you look kind of in further, it won't typically be in the deep forest, just along the edges. And this time of year, again, still green when everything else has died, so very easy to identify this time of year.
There's some real thickets and monocultures of this near here too.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Like just in Macan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and where?
Yeah, this one spreads super easy because these berries, while poisonous to us, are delectable to the birds. So they pick them up and take them to another forest and drop them off, and that's how it spreads typically. Identification. So, like I said, deciduous shrub or small tree, often multi-stemmed, but can be a single trunk that can grow up to 20 feet tall. The bark and stems. The new growth is soft and green with little hairs on them. And then as it ages, it turns into this kind of grayish brown bark with the little white flecks, which are called lenticles. And the winter buds lack scales and are rusty in color. The leaves are they're simple and glossy on top with smooth edges and prominent veins. If you look at this leaf, it kind of looks almost like a drawing of a leaf. Like when you think leaf, it's the shiny, extremely simple, round. One of the features is that all of the veins are kind of reaching towards the top instead of going straight out. Yeah, the glossiness, that's where it gets its name, is from the shiny top surface of the leaf. And then berries. So they start green and they mature to red or purple. The red and purple berries can co-occur, so it might have both on one plant. And as I said, poisonous to people. Oh, okay. So that's it on glossy buckthorn. The major threat that this one poses is just overtaking understory, so pushing out native plants. But it is beneficial to the native birds and stuff who survive off the berries. So it's a bit of a toss-up. But yeah, not great for other kind of plant species because it takes up all the light and the space so that they can't survive.
It makes a terrible thicket to try to hike through.
It does, yeah. Grows very, very dense. Okay, taking action. There's lots of things that you can do to prevent invasive species. These are just some shots, and then we'll go into each of them. So, I really like the invasive species space because I think it's one of the only environmental issues that, like, individual action really matters. It's important. So people typically are spreading invasive species just like regular guys who have something stuck on their boat or on their shirt or whatever, and they carry it by accident. Sometimes it's bigger stuff like shipping or whatever that you can't really control, but for the most part it is individual action that can really prevent the spread of these species. So we're going to hop into a couple of our behavioral change programs that we have that are related to those pathways. So first we have Play Clean Go. So I'm sure you as nature folks have noticed, you go walk through a field or a forest and you come out covered in seeds and plant bits and mud and bugs. And it's really important that when you do that, you brush off everything that you can at the location that you picked it up from. So obviously if you've got a bunch of seeds stuck in your boots and then you take those boots and walk somewhere else, you're dropping those seeds off. So making sure that you're doing your part to clean off all of your clothing, your body, your pets, your equipment, anything you got, Play Clean Go. And then our next program is Buy Local, Burn Local. So we didn't really get into any of the forest pest species, but we have quite a few forest pest invasives in New Brunswick, and a lot of them are spread through the movement of firewood. So for example, New Brunswick, it has regulated areas for the movement of firewood because of the emerald ash borer. So that's a tiny little beetle that has absolutely decimated ash throughout North America, kills up to 99% of ash trees in areas where it's infested. And most people don't know what their firewood is, so it's very easy for someone to like pick up a log, not having any idea that it's infested ash, and then they pick that up and take it to wherever. And those people in that area will not be thankful to you for bringing emerald ash borer. Or like conversely, Nova Scotia and Maine both have the hemlock woolly adelgid, which we do not have in New Brunswick yet. So if you were to accidentally like bring some wood over from there, you could very easily transport that species here. So making sure that you're either sourcing your wood from very close to where you plan to burn it, or you're getting pre-treated wood, like what they have at like Canadian Tire at the gas station, where it's like being heat treated and certified pest free.
Can you just say what's the status of, I was going to ask, emerald ash borer here?
Emerald ash borer is very, very widespread in New Brunswick. There's still some areas that it hasn't reached yet, but it is spreading quickly. It's very common in the Fredericton area, in the Edmonton area, and the Moncton area. Kind of all along the highway, it seems like that's how it's traveling, and then spreading outwards from those areas. We are still working with CFIA to track that. So over the summer, we put up traps throughout the province, and then we take them down, check them for emerald ash borer, and every year they are more spread than they were before. And so likely in the next few years that firewood ban will be lifted because it will be everywhere. There are some promising biological control for emerald ash borer being developed, and in areas where they've tested that, they've seen really impressive regrowth of ash. So there is hope, and there's also hope that we can because that's being really well developed, and because it's not everywhere in New Brunswick, we will be able to preserve our ash. In a lot of places where it got there a lot earlier, it destroyed all of the ash, and they've had to replant from stock outside of that area. Whereas if we're careful about the spread of ash borer here, we may be able to preserve some of those, which would be ideal, obviously. As ash is super important, both economically but spiritually to Indigenous people. So we want to work really hard to make sure that doesn't spread. Yeah.
Does the ash borer attack all species of ash, or are there some more susceptible than others?
I know that some species are more susceptible to it, but all are susceptible. So typically, I can't remember which species like is most to least, but typically it'll take out, say, like olive green ash, and then it'll go back for the black ash, and then it'll go back for the white ash. I think there's one species of Asian ash that it doesn't attack, but I'm not certain about that. But yeah, it does affect all ash. Then yeah, next we have Clean Drain Dry. So I touched on that a little bit earlier. This is very similar to our Play Clean Go program, where if you're out on the water, you can very easily pick up hitchhikers on your boat or in your equipment, kind of anything like that. So making sure that you are cleaning off everything, so doing a visual inspection of your equipment to pull off any plant bits, any wiping off any mud, anything like that, and making sure to dispose of it either on dry land or in the garbage, because obviously it's not really helpful to be cleaning your boat if you just chuck it into a native water body. Then drain, so making sure that all of the water is dumped out. So if you're in a kayak or a canoe, making sure you're tipping all the water out. If you're in a motorboat, making sure that the live wells and the bait boxes and all of that are completely drained, and pulling all the plugs. And again, like the first one, you want to make sure that the water is either flowing into the water body you came from or onto dry land, so you're not spreading it. And then dry, making sure that all the surfaces are completely dry, ideally by towel drying them. You can air dry your stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will get completely dry. And for things like zebra mussels, where they can exist for extended periods in just humid environments but out of water, if you leave it to air dry, you could have to wait upwards of a month to know that that was effective. Whereas if you towel dry it off, they're much less likely to be able to survive that. So making sure everything is nice and dry. And this is most important when you're moving between water bodies. So if you are always going to the same lake, you don't really have to worry about washing your boat in between like trips to that lake. But for instance, if you are on the Woolloostook, it is extremely important that you wash off your boat. And we're working with a lot of different partners, including the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, to have boat wash stations installed throughout the province. And we also have some mobile boat wash stations, which we take to things like fishing tournaments. So where people are coming from far away, we want to wash off their boats too.
Hose treatment do it?
For most of it will. Ideally for zebra mussels, it's hot water to make sure that they get killed, but not everyone has access to hot water to spray on their boat, so just spraying it off. Doing what you can is good enough, but ideally it would be hot water.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So I kayak, so I often put in a tiny little spots where you can get in. How, like, I get the towel thing, but how do I wash it off?
So you could wash off when you get home. So if you're bringing it back to your house, you can hose it off, especially if there's no like water bodies on your property. So if there is, you just want to do it far enough away from that the water's not running into wherever. But you can just take it off and rinse it at home. Or some people bring disinfectant spray down your thing and then wipe it off. There's a couple different options there, but yeah. And then finally we have Be a Citizen Scientist. So I'm sure all of you have heard of iNaturalist before, but if you haven't, it's an app or a website where you can take a photo of a species, be it a plant, fish, a mammal, anything, and you can upload it there, and either the members or the AI that they have will identify it for you. And if it turns out to be invasive, we will get a notification that an invasive species has been found and where. And that one's really great because if you are not sure, you're like, I don't know if I've seen this before, I'm not sure if it's native or not, you can just upload it up there and it'll figure it out for you. And that one's really important because better data equals better management. Like I said at the beginning, we really want to try and get things as early as possible, right? And the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council is only 4 people. We can't look into every nook and cranny of this province, but people like you who are out in nature all of the time, you might be some of the only people who will see these species. So knowing your invasive species or just taking pictures of stuff you don't know, you're not sure about, and uploading it is super helpful to us. And that's it. I'm happy to take any questions you have about any invasive species related stuff.
You didn't touch on purple loosestrife. Is that less of a problem now?
Purple loosestrife is an interesting question. It is anecdotally spreading in the province. We've heard that over the last few years. But in the late 90s, a biocontrol was released here in New Brunswick, which is presumably why it didn't take hold for a long time in the way that it has in other areas. And it's still an open question about why it is that it seems that purple loosestrife is spreading in the province. And that's something we want to look into at the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council, trying to see, we're hoping to do like a study to see if the beetles are still existing in New Brunswick. In some areas where the biocontrol has been released, they die off and then the purple loosestrife rebounds. It might also be climatic conditions. So there's some questions there about the purple loosestrife, but it is still invasive, definitely.
Yeah, because we had a fairly significant population here in the waterfall park, and the beetles were introduced and it cut it back. It was still around. Have people noticed that it's getting thicker now? It's around, but it's not taking over.
Maybe a little more widespread, but
not taking over everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in areas before they introduced that beetle, it would take over like an entire wetland. There'd be basically nothing left. So it does seem better than that. So there's something keeping it in check.
Yeah.
But we have gotten quite a few reports over the last 2 or 3 years. People saying that they're seeing it expanding. So that's a question for us that we're looking into.
Could you say something about the garlic mustard? Because last summer, somebody came by my garden to check to see if I could identify it. And they were making a map of its distribution. And they gave me instruction as to how to dispose of it. I guess what I've done is I've taken it in bags to the landfill with the garbage. Is that a good enough in terms of, I didn't quite know where else to dispose of it, other than that. I mean, obviously it's not going to, I want to get it out of the garden. I wasn't sure if the landfill was in fact suitable.
Yes, the landfill is the best place you can put it. It's really important that when you're removing invasive species, it's not going in your yard waste and composting, because then it's just going to get spread from there. But at the landfill, it's going to get buried, and so that's the best option that we have for it. At least in the Greater Moncton area, Eco 360, they ask that you double bag invasive species, but I'm not sure what the recommendations are for other landfills, but landfill is the best bet.
So you mean you didn't put it in composting bags to the landfill, you put it in garbage bags?
Yeah, I
Like
put it in.
clear garbage bags, is that how you disposed of it, or was it?
Well,
like
actually, I
paper?
double bagged it. I have a sort of a feed bag, which is opaque, and then I put that inside the clear plastic bag in order to make sure that it gets to the
Like
landfill.
streamed
But-
into the land.
I would have thought that composting would actually do it. If you've ever gone to the Berry Mills facility, I have, it's an incredible process that they go through. It takes 40 days for the compost to go through that system. And it really is broken down by the end.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that invasive or other species would be completely
Yes.
destroyed at that point.
For the most part, they are, if proper, like, so if the compost gets to a high enough heat, that typically does kill a lot of invasive species. But as a general rule, just in case that's not happening at whatever compost facility, it's just safer to send it straight to the landfill. Because some compost facilities, they don't have as high a standard as, say, like the Eco 360 facilities.
Yeah, ours goes to that one.
Yeah.
All cycle goes through.
Yeah. So they, in all likelihood, that would be enough to kind of heat up everything enough to kill it. But in our talks with Eco 360 and like others, Eco 360 still wants it going to the landfill, and a lot of facilities, yeah, they're not getting up to that kind of heat and those other conditions that are necessary. So it's just better to send it to the landfill.
Just wondering how they're coping with zebra mussel in Europe. Has it reached some kind of equilibrium there?
It's better controlled in Europe, in its native range, just because it has like more predators and stuff that are able to keep it in check. Here in Canada, basically the only thing that eats it is ducks a little bit, but not enough to impact it, and then the round goby, which is also invasive. Around the neighborhood. Yeah, we don't have that one here in New Brunswick yet, but yeah, that's kind of what's controlling it a little bit more in the Great Lakes, is that invasive goby. Yeah.
I'm gonna give an update on this later on to the group, but we're dealing with multiflora rose in a quarry project that we're working with here. And it's a wetland, and Saco's got a pretty stringent pesticide and herbicide law, so we can't do much there in terms of herbiciding. If you read the websites, they basically say cut it off, put poison on the cut off surface, and that'll get absorbed and kill the roots.
Yeah.
So what we've decided to do is we've purchased a couple of pullers called extractigators,
Yes. Yeah.
which are great big metal things that grab the base of the plant and haul it out by the roots. And then we've also bought a small portable chipper shredder, which we're going to bring into the quarry and put all the pieces that we've ripped out into that shredder, park it on a big tarpaulin so we don't lose bits, shred it and take it out. And then we were going to take it to the Eco 360 compost, but we'll have to check on what we want to do with that.
Yeah, I would.
That's the approach that we decided to take, and we're not planning to eliminate it from the quarry. We're planning on sort of controlling it and getting it at a certain time, because we know that it's going to be a long, continuous process.
Yes, definitely a battle. Multiflora rose is one that it doesn't like to get killed. It persists. But yeah, that method
So
does
have you
sound
got any other suggestions that we
that's
might think about?
pretty. That's along the lines of the control methods I've heard before for multiflora rose. Another one that I would recommend is repeated cutting. So if you cut it back to its base repeatedly, and then tarping over the stump. So you cut it at its base and you cover the stump in black plastic, and that kind of will kill the root, which will make it easier to pull out with the extractigator. Sometimes they're really in there, you can't get them fully out until they're like weakened. So that'd be kind of the only other thing I would suggest for that. And then like repeated cutting over time will weaken the roots at the bottom and allow you to pull it out more fully.
How about salt as an alternative to glyphosate? You said glyphosate's not gonna completely eradicate the, say, Japanese knotweed, but do you know anything about salt as an alternative?
I have actually heard about salt being used. Actually, at one of the fungi sites, they salted the earth, and that actually turned out to be quite effective. But I've heard that's kind of more dependent on the conditions of the patch, and you really have to like use a tremendous amount of salt, and at a certain point, then you're like making the environment unsuitable for anything else to reestablish in the site.
Go alongside replanting a new species or aspen trees.
Yeah,
and then
so
you don't have that environment left over.
exactly, right? So yeah, it's very, obviously in the literal sense, salting the earth, so nothing can grow there at all, which is not.
Bayberry, there are plants that are very salt tolerant.
Yes,
so.
yeah. So there are, different kind of strategies. There's actually, Japanese knotweed, there's 1,001 things that everyone recommends to deal with it. There are lots of internet support groups where they have lots of different strategies for it. But they try all sorts of things. And some things work, but a lot of things are conditional to the site characteristics. So if it's a really happy patch of Japanese knotweed, it's wet, it's full sun or whatever, it's basically impossible to kill. Whereas something that's like more in the forest might be susceptible to something like that.
And do you have a general, we've been waging a war with Japanese knotweed for decades. And we've made some progress in some areas, but it seems to be able to pop up like about 100 feet away.
Yes, yeah.
Do they also, are their seeds productive and they carried by birds, or is it underground?
No, so that's
rhizomes?
in all likelihood the same plant. It's in all likelihood the same plant that you're seeing. It's just popped
Yeah.
up somewhere else.
But
There is debate, but for the most part, people believe that the seed is not fertile in North America.
Okay.
It's almost entirely, or likely entirely by clone. So when they recommend, or when you're tarping or trying to handle Japanese knotweed, they recommend, however large the patch is, doing at least a third of that side on every side around it, treating it, so tarping it or doing whatever treatment you're doing, because it can send out its runners extremely far. So yeah, it's a tough one to crack for sure.
Is repeated cutting productive at all? I mean, it seems to, if you cut, do you have to take away your cuttings as well?
No,
Or can you
typically
leave them
they
to dry?
You can leave them to dry, typically they don't reroot. The cutting can weaken the root system, which is better for preventing further spread. So
Okay.
if it's spending all of its time trying to regrow, it won't spread outwards, but it's typically not that effective at actually like killing the plant itself, just kind of controlling it.
But like, I have a big patch that's sort of on the border of our property. So if I continue to cut into that a little bit and make sure everything on our side of the property is cut, will that lessen the chance of it encroaching?
Yeah.
You know?
Yes.
Because I notice neighbors will have patches, but it's farmed all around it, so it remains a discrete patch.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're trying to keep it from spreading and not eradicating it, then mowing is your best option. You can kind of keep them in check, if not completely remove them.
Yeah.
I've wondered about in areas where you can mow, even if it's a big patch, if you keep it flat enough, if you just kept mowing it like a lawn for years, it would, maybe you'd still, 10 years later, still have little sprigs and little bits of root there, but.
Yeah. There's a study happening in Alma right now where that's their method, is repeated cutting. And there is some promise in that, and especially in strategic cutting. So there's certain times of the year when the roots have less energy, and then other times of the year where the plant is moving energy into the root system. So if you cut it when it's at its, when there's the least amount of energy in the roots, that's kind of your best bet at killing it. Whereas if you cut it at the wrong time of year, when it's already stored all of its energy in its roots, it's basically ineffective.
So what are those time periods?
I'm trying to think. So it's called a critical cutting period, if anyone wants to Google it after. And for Japanese knotweed, I think you let it get 3 feet high in the spring, because it's used up all of the energy it's stored over winter to pop those up. Then you cut it then so that it can't put the translocate those nutrients back down. And then basically you keep doing that. You let it get to 3 feet and cut it again throughout the summer until well, forever.
So slowly the plants will get smaller, but they'll still be there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And even if you were able to like have it well controlled in that way, you would have to then, even if you think it's dead, keep an eye on it for 5+ years, because it can stay dormant in the soil for that long.
Sure.
So you can think you had it well beat for like 5 years, then it comes right back up. It's not great. Yeah.
You said something very quickly earlier about how New Brunswick has no sort of policies about invasive.
Yeah.
Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, we don't have anything. We don't have any laws related to it.
Do other provinces, like how
Yes,
do they compare?
yeah,
Okay.
definitely. They a lot of provinces have regulations on what species you're allowed to transport. So, for example, I showed Alberta, they have the sniffer dogs. That's because it's technically illegal to transport zebra and quagga mussels throughout Alberta. And that basically just means that they're not going to charge you with anything, but they're just going to make you clean your boat. But that's an example. In a lot of regions, there's like a do not plant list. So in the state of Maine, they have an extensive list of plants that it's illegal to sell and it's illegal to transport. So that's another one. Similar, the same thing in the state of Maine. It's illegal to travel around with your boat plugs in. You have to pull them to drain your boat, and if you don't do that, you can get a ticket. So there's a lot of different kind of elements like that, and we don't have anything like that in New Brunswick. And that basically comes down to the fact that invasive species doesn't fall into anybody's mandate. So it's not the Department of Environment and Energy, it's not the Department of Fisheries, it's not in anyone's bucket, so no one touches it. There's a bit of like regulation around fisheries, but that's federal regulations that just
Right.
happen in New Brunswick.
Well, you would think it would fall under the environment, and,
You would.
yeah.
Is that part of, like, is that part of, when your first slide said sort of what your mandate is?
Yes.
Do you work on that as well, or how do you?
So we are, for the most part, kind of like apolitical. We don't really take a lot of positions on that. But we do try and work with the different departments of government to work on stuff that, different projects and whatever, but we can't really put forward legislation. If it were to come up, not from us, we would definitely be supportive of it, but it's kind of the prerogative of Canada Invasives that we don't really get into legislative issues because we want to try and maintain good relationships with these departments of government. Like a lot of them, even though it's not in their mandate and there's no regulations, they still work with us on funding and on different kind of projects to control invasive species, but like I said, there's no laws associated with it, and they're not like obligated to do that as part of their mandate. It's very odd, yeah.
But could you not make recommendations like that politely? Or is
yes,
that
and I
Nature MB, would they do
At least
something
you're
like that?
talking to each other in a cordial manner.
yeah, exactly. And there has been, like, they're aware that that is an issue that they have, that it doesn't sit with anyone. But yeah, it's a very complex situation for sure, which is obviously negatively affecting the environment here in New Brunswick and kind of being able to get anything done around invasive species. Because basically, like, we can recommend people clean, drain, dry, or we can recommend that people wash their boat, but in other, like, in certain parts of the states, like, you are legally mandated to do that. And in places where they've studied it, no one does it until it's mandated, right? Obviously, everyone kind of, that's obvious to most people. But yeah, we don't have anything like that. So it's not great, but yeah.
Just curious, what's the scoop on Canada geese? I assume they're invasive, the particular ones we have here. They're not the native original ones, they were introduced.
Yeah.
And are they growing, or are they stabilized?
I would consider them like that naturalized thing where like they're not native to New Brunswick, but they're like kind of native. They're like native to Canada. They're kind of, it's like a complex issue as well. But with those, they can't be considered invasive because they're a federal migratory bird. So we can't do anything to control them. Yeah, so there's a lot of different weird rules that you wouldn't think of, but that's one of them.
I may have heard wrong, but you alluded to a lake at the head of the St. John River. What lake is that?
Lake Temeswada. So it's on the other side of the Quebec border, but it flows into the Wolusta in that
Oh, so
source.
it's on the Quebec side.
Yeah, yeah.
So it'll be St. Francois River probably.
Potentially, I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, I know that it does flow down into it's in Lake Temeswada and it flowed down in here, but I'm not sure the exact tributary.
Because where muskie got started too.
Hmm?
A muskellunge, I think, started up there too.
Yeah, we have a lot of stuff for Quebec. Either Quebec or Maine is typically where our stuff comes from, but we've got a couple coming at us from Nova Scotia too, so gotta keep a lookout on all sides. Yeah.
One more question. You talked about how Maine has a list of plants that can't be sold.
Yes.
Does your organization have a list that you would recommend not be bought?
We have
or
what we call
planted?
what's called our Grow Me Instead guide. You can look at that on our website, and that is a guide showing some of the most popular horticultural species that are invasive, and then native alternatives. So something that'll grow in the same space, have the same kind of aesthetic values as the invasive, but offering you a native. And then Canada Invasive, so our national organization, is working with kind of the national body for plant sellers and horticulturalists to develop more of that kind of thing. It's obviously quite a touchy subject with our industry partners, who a lot of these invasives are their biggest sellers, right? So if we're out telling people, "Look, you shouldn't buy that, you shouldn't be allowed to buy that," that's not making us a lot of friends in that space. So we are trying to work on like positive relationships with them to make those changes now, and then hopefully reduce the demand for those species. So then when hopefully someone decides to come up with legislation down the line, it won't be as negative.
But if you're also making recommendations to buy other things,
Mhm.
then it should be a win-win.
Yeah, so that's where we're kind of going with this grow me instead of like a do not plant, or like a regulated.
Instead of this, do this.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what we're going for right now. And then that has kind of the double effect of a lot of the times, like there are not native species available, or if there are native species available, they're significantly more expensive. So if we're kind of trying to shift the market towards native, so then when, or if or when invasive species become regulated, it won't be such a big deal for those sellers. Anyone?
Clarissa, thank you so much
thank
on
you.
behalf of the Chignecto Naturalist Club.
Thank
The
you.
New Brunswick Invasive Species Council is very lucky to have you as part of their team. You did a wonderful presentation, and really thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It was great to talk to you all. Please let me know if you have any questions. Yeah, if you have any questions to follow up with, you can reach out to us here at our main email, or I can also give you my card if anyone wants to talk to me.